Well, welcome everyone to our new look online COVID-free ThinkHouse Unlocked. I have to say we're missing meeting you all in person, and we're doing our best to keep in touch as best we can, in this case through a series of online and live webinars and seminars. This is the third in the series. We're talking about fraud in times of crisis. And I'd like you to give a big welcome to our two resident fraudsters here, Alex, Jay and Brid Holden, who are experts in our litigation team, well used to dealing with major fraud cases and matters. Lest you think that fraud is a matter of minor significance, here's a few statistics for you. Worldwide, the impact of fraud is around 6% of gross domestic product. That's quite a significant number. In the UK, that translates to somewhere between 130 and 190, wait for it, billion pounds a year. And the average UK business is likely to lose somewhere between 3 and 6% of its revenue to fraud. And in some cases, in major cases, that can be as high as 10%. Fraud is also a particular issue in the government and public sector circles as well. And it's fair to say that fraudsters are not shy about creating opportunity out of the kinds of crises that government gets involved with. And so I'd like to turn, I think, directly to Alex. I think you'd agree we are definitely in unprecedented times and times of crisis. How is the fraud market shaping up at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think that's fair to say, Michael. We certainly are in unprecedented times. And in terms of the impact on fraud that is going to arise as a result, there's a couple of things we can say. You know, we can look back, of course, at history to draw comparisons with a number of similar events, because of course the current COVID course of events is a crisis in its own right, you know, a healthcare crisis, but it's also created an economic crisis that we're feeling. We've seen unprecedented negative GDP spikes. We've, you know, every time you read the papers, there's often more bad news about struggling businesses or job losses, all of the sort of things that are indicators of difficult financial times. And of course, you only need to look back at the financial crash, the credit crunch of 08-09, for a similar, I suppose, level of financial impact from a recession, to try to draw some comparisons. And you know, what we saw in the credit crunch was, as reported by KPMG, who produce a fraud indication report every year. In the wake of the credit crunch, we saw the second highest recorded amount of fraud in the history of KPMG's survey. So we saw unprecedented levels of fraud. And of course, that's always driven because hard financial times drive fraud. You have businesses, people under financial pressure that can drive poor behavior. You have fraudsters who take advantage of difficult financial times to try to persuade people to invest their money, to promise returns at times when people need them. You have all of these sorts of issues that arise where you have a difficult financial landscape that simply drives up instances of fraud. So looking at the effect of COVID from a financial perspective and the significant impact on the economy that it's having, I think from that point of view, you can certainly say that we are likely to experience significantly increased levels of fraud just because of the financial impact alone.
I think some wise old saw said that those of us who do not learn the lessons of history are destined to repeat them. What further detail can you sort of pick out about those lessons of history, and what should we squirrel away for use?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting and perceptive question. I already talked about the COVID course of events being a financial well, causing a financial crisis, but also being in its own right a crisis that needs to be addressed, and it needs to have lots of measures put in place, and lots of people are doing lots of different things in different ways, whether that's trying to produce a vaccine or trying to produce more face masks than we've ever probably needed in history in a short space of time. But a crisis generates a response, and sadly, we can look back at history, at crises, and we can see that fraudsters try to capitalise on the response. So if you go back to 2001, in the UK, we had the foot and mouth crisis. This was a disease affecting cattle that was a very contagious, problem, and resulted in a very significant government-led initiative to try and address the problem. As part of that, lots of contractors were hired to help with the disposal of cattle and management of tracking where cattle go and all of that sort of stuff. And obviously lots of people responded very positively, but some people also took advantage, overcharging the government in effect, because in its rush to put out and to engage people to help with the crisis, of course, the normal checks and balances that you might apply in a more dispassionate contract process weren't always able to be implemented, and people took advantage and overcharged. And I know there was a day of reckoning after the immediate crisis had been dealt with, to deal with people who had overcharged, but that's what happened. Wind forward a few years, some people might remember the Indian Ocean tsunami that caused a lot of damage, particularly to island states, sort of Indonesia and some of the Indian Ocean island countries. And there was a huge international aid effort. I think something like $6.25 billion was ultimately advanced to assist affected areas. I happen to know, because we worked on a case, that not all of that money was applied properly, and in fact, some of it was misappropriated by particular individuals who took advantage of the amount of aid being made available, and they took advantage and effectively siphoned it off for their own benefit. And that's an interesting point. One of the reasons why crises and fraudsters often come together is because fraudsters know that where there's a crisis and there's an economic response, there's an opportunity for them to tap into monies being made available and to take them for their own advantage. A few more examples: Hurricane Katrina, that was the hurricane that hit Louisiana, described as the most destructive natural disaster in US history. And yet, an interesting stat that underlines the point around fraudsters taking advantage of a crisis. Within a week of Hurricane Katrina making landfall, the FBI estimated that there were nearly 2,500 fraudulent Hurricane Katrina internet sites of the sort of, we can help, click here, pay us a fee, and as a stark example of how quickly fraudsters will try to take advantage, that is one. Two other quick ones that certainly the UK audience will remember, and the Americans. The BP oil spill, Deepwater Horizon, there was a huge number of fraudulent insurance claims on the back of that, claiming you'd been adversely affected by the oil, and we hadn't really. So that was something that happened. And of course, people will remember the Grenfell tower block fire. Even that, and that was a fairly difficult event, of course, and there was a huge response to that. But even that was targeted by fraudsters. It was reported, I think, that at least $1 million was lost to fraudsters, effectively seeking to take benefit from the support being offered by the government to affected people. So, drawing the threads of that together, what we have here is we have a crisis that will be targeted by fraudsters. There's a huge economic response being put out by the government. That will be targeted. It's already reported that that's being targeted, as you commented on in your opening statement. But we have the additional double-pronged attack here, in that this is a crisis in its own right, which is driving also a financial crisis. So we have two problems to deal with, and I think that is going to exacerbate matters, and we're going to see unprecedented levels of fraud. In fact, Jim Chanos, who's a well-known Wall Street trader, has come out in an article in the last few days and said we are entering what he calls a quote golden age of fraud. So that is a nice pithy, I suppose, line, which I tend to agree with in terms of the times that we are heading into.
What a depressing view of humanity, that people will always take advantage of other people's misfortunes for their own gain. How just depressing is that? But why don't you can you play your own Jim Chanos, please, Alex, and give us some view of where you think the future will go. How, in your experience, how's it shaping up right now?
Well, I think we're already seeing significant reported instances of fraud. We're seeing cases being reported and flagged in the press already about the furlough scheme being targeted by fraudsters. No doubt the other government support schemes will also fall victim in some part to being targeted by fraudsters. We're already seeing on the economic side of things a number of businesses which are struggling in one form or another. And of course, we still have a number of government support schemes running. We have some coming to an end. There was a deferment of tax payment obligations to early next year. And lots of businesses will have taken advantage of that. But of course, when those come to an end, I think we will see a rather different complexion put on the economy, and that is going to significantly drive not only the types of behaviour which give rise to fraud, people under pressure committing more fraud, but it's also going to lead to frauds being uncovered. As people, if you can keep your business going, you can broadly cover up a fraud, in a lot of circumstances. If you can't, then it will come to the fore. Same thing that happened in the Alan Stanford Ponzi scheme collapse. It came to the fore in the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, because you could no longer keep enough money coming in to pay out those investors. When everybody turned around and said, "Can I have my money back now?" it became apparent that actually you hadn't been investing their money and it was all a Ponzi scheme. Exactly the same, really, as Bernie Madoff. So I suspect we might see some fairly large scale issues arise on the back of the current events.
Brid, can I bring you in here? I mean, looking specifically at obviously COVID itself, the impact of COVID, but also the impact of COVID on the economy. Are we going to see special types of fraud cropping up? What are the types of fraud that we're likely to see coming out of this crisis?
Of course, well, the offence of fraud itself is very far-reaching, so you can imagine there are many different categories of fraud which are captured by it. It's probably worth just revisiting that offence just to give an idea of how far-reaching it is. So it involves the person dishonestly making a false representation or wrongfully failing to disclose information or abusing a position of trust with intent to make a gain or cause a loss or to expose another to the risk of loss. So action fraud categorises some 48 different types of fraud. Most involve the fraudster obtaining a dishonest advantage, often financial, over the victim. Having dealt with so many different types of fraud, it's not a victimless crime, and it's got far-reaching consequences for the victim, be that an individual or a corporate. Now, looking at personal fraud or fraud against individuals, there have been certain studies that have been produced, and the Office for National Statistics released a summary on the nature of fraud and computer misuse in England and Wales for the year ending March 2019, and it reported that 1 in 8 victims of fraud were victimised more than once, a statistic that has remained fairly constant for the previous 3 years for which data is available. So there's coincidentally as well, and this actually was surprising, but fraud victimization, the likelihood of being a victim is greater in higher income households, and it's lower in older age groups, save for investment fraud, where the older age group is more likely to be a target. Now, in 76% of frauds, the victim incurred a financial loss. These sorts of statistics are a bit of a wake-up call. But then looking at corporate fraud, which is probably more relevant to the audience here today, Michael, you mentioned some really stark statistics about global losses caused by fraud and corporates. PwC produced a global economic crime survey in 2020, and the UK findings reported that 56% of respondents experienced fraud in the last 24 months. Very, very high number. 33% lost an opportunity to a competitor who they believed had paid a bribe, and 28% unsurprisingly cite cybercrime as the most disruptive type of fraud. So experience and analysis from the economic crisis shows us that these figures are likely to increase, and considerably so, and Alex has touched on that. Corporate fraud is really far-reaching. You know, it can range from account takeover, mandate fraud, procurement, false invoices, domain name scams, intellectual property fraud, procurement fraud, insurance fraud. I could go on. I could probably speak for half an hour about the various types of fraud that can occur to corporates. So looking ahead, there's no new rule book as a result of COVID-19 and the economic crisis, you know, for corporates and individuals alike, in terms of prevention and protection, really, you know, a system of checks and balances, segregation of duty, proportionate checking regimes, and awareness of responsibilities for the employees, and then post-event assurance when fraud does take place.
And I think one of the elements of COVID, and I wonder whether just sort of focusing in on that a bit particularly, we're all working quite a bit from home, and I don't know whether it's just me, but I've had quite a few phishing attempts coming through from strange and weird and wonderful places. Are we seeing an increase in cyber fraud, and what other types of frauds are particularly picking up at this time?
Yeah, so looking specifically, I suppose, at COVID-19, what we are seeing is, well, I suppose firstly, forecasting economic outlooks are always fraught with uncertainty, but we are seeing some specific types of fraud. So I know, Michael, you and I chatted a while ago about the number of companies which were incorporated, Companies House, with COVID in their name since the pandemic took hold. So we've got, for instance, COVID-19 Claims Limited, COVID-19 Grants and Loans Limited, and COVID-19 Virus Compensation Limited. Now, I know Alex has touched about those websites, thousands of websites after Hurricane Katrina. We're seeing something very similar here in the UK. So in terms of threats from a fraud perspective and what we're seeing our clients facing, we're seeing a huge, or we would predict a huge increase in certain types of frauds. These particularly range from health sector fraud. So fraud within the NHS was estimated in 2019 at in excess of 1.2 billion per year. That's the equivalent of 40,000 nurses. Obviously, there's a clear threat, or there is increased fraud within the NHS because of the pandemic's perfect crisis, really, if you think, for fraudsters. So we're seeing this being widely reported on. For example, vaccines, sanitizers, PPE, ventilators. Threat of fraud exists both internally within the NHS trust, etc., and externally via suppliers. Can range from fraud involving procurement, mandate, recruitment, and payroll. We're also seeing investment fraud. Again, you know, this is something that we advise on time and time again. Pandemic and economic crisis are a perfect storm for this type of fraud. So savers' pension pots are very, very vulnerable, and particularly so since the introduction of the pension freedoms. Some 54 million of combined savings were targeted by scammers at 13 providers last year alone. That's, 54 million pounds is a large amount of money in terms of pension pots. There will be a significant increase, in my view, in pension investment and pension liberation frauds as people are drawn in by the prospect of increased returns, particularly in an economic crisis where interest rates at the bank is low and people also may be facing redundancy, etc., etc. So the media is already reporting a big increase in advanced fee schemes. So, for instance, we've seen criminals, and probably I have to say I've been on the receiving end of emails involving Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency, for example. So investment fraud as well, we've predicted and indeed see that this rose considerably during lockdown. When you think you've got that category of older people who were isolating or self-isolating, whatever, and more vulnerable. The commodities, I suppose, this fraud's been around for a long time. Commodities may vary, but how the scam works is largely unchanged. There's probability, I suppose, that the commodity may be COVID-19 related as a lure to potential investors with usual return or promise rather of high returns, which never come true, and the altruistic nature of such investment schemes as well. So another fraud, and Alex briefly touched on this, is legacy fraud, and that's where, you know, when a company enters recession or some sort of or rather an insolvency procedure, some sort of takeover, often then frauds are uncovered. Because, you know, the accounts are looked at, the financials are subject to scrutiny, which previously, you know, if the fraud was taking place within a corporate, it could have been capable of being concealed. We've advised extensively on this, and I can see this becoming very prevalent in the coming months, particularly as the government support packages are withdrawn. I'm not going to go into market manipulation cartels today. Safe to say, obviously, there has been a relaxation in rules, which means that fraud is likely to be occurring there as well. But as those rules are implemented again or re-implemented, it will come out. It always does, I think. So yeah, you mentioned, Michael, and obviously it's a big issue, no doubt, for the people today. Cyber fraud, key concern for many of our clients. Cybersecurity is such a significant part of corporate culture now, with cybercrime becoming increasingly sophisticated and very, very difficult to predict, and with the resultant high losses also. So we're working from home, significant number of us, either full-time or part-time. For many of people, this is a change to what would have been their usual working pattern. For the individual and corporates alike, the right infrastructure may not have been in place or properly trialed before we all started this home working. So cyber and hacking criminals, they really do not care, and they're taking advantage. In the UK, the NCSC has detected more UK government branded scams related to COVID-19 than any other subject. So one of the key threats observed by the NCSC are phishing attacks, which hackers often use as a first route into organisation. And again, I can hold up my hands and say, I've had emails during the course of lockdown, where if you're distracted, you might be inclined to press on them. And that's the difficulty. They request credentials or malware, and malware is commonly hidden in those emails. And individuals are invited to click on a link that takes them to web pages run by cyber criminals. And the other thing to note about cyber criminals is that, they are becoming ever increasingly creative in devising new ways to exploit users and technology, to access passwords, networks, and data. We can see as well, there's a heavy emphasis on the minute on SIM card and then being able to access your SIM cards, etc., etc. So there is, it's fair to say, a heightened risk with people working from home for corporates, so that you're away from colleagues and the workplace environment, and you may be distracted, I know in my case, by children or family members at home, because you are at home. People may become less vigilant and click on a link that they wouldn't generally do, and they would have thought twice about it in previous circumstances. And the attacks as well, is worth knowing, they also play on individuals' heightened anxiety in the time of COVID-19. So it's just a case, I think, of being vigilant, being aware, making sure the assurances, or making sure the systems and the checks are in place. And that's what I would say.
Well, it certainly sounds, you've certainly presented a picture of very much increased risk environment, actually, in terms of successful fraud. And I wonder, just as sort of passing comments or final passing comments from both of you, I might ask you, Alex, to give us some views on how you might manage general fraud risk, and Brid, if you wouldn't mind, some views specifically on the cyber fraud elements. Alex first.
No, certainly. Look, for managing general fraud risk, every organisation is exposed to fraud. And if you think your organisation isn't, then it probably means that there is fraud going undetected. It happens to everybody. As we're going into a period where we're expecting a heightened risk of fraud, a prudent thing to do would be to make sure you're undertaking regular fraud risk assessments. This involves sitting down, often depending on the size and scale of your organisation, with different people across the business to try to understand how your business would be targeted. You know, where does money or property leave your business? How can people take advantage of it for financial gain? All of those things. You will know your organisations. Sit down, engage people who have maybe more experience on dealing with cases of fraud to help you to understand areas to focus on. But sit down and think where you might be targeted and where you can help to prevent that. You know, what internal controls can you introduce? How can you try to ensure that you're as insulated from fraud as you can be? And if there's one takeaway thing to remember, it is a maxim that is cited regularly in fraud circles, anti-fraud circles. It is that if you increase the perception in the minds of those that you deal with or are employed by your business, that if a fraud is carried out against the business, it will be detected. So you increase the perception of detection, then that is one of the best things you can do to stop a fraud happening in the first place, because an awful lot of people will not commit fraud at all, and an awful lot of people will be, if they were minded to do it, they will think twice if they consider there is a serious risk of being caught. If they do, and of course if they don't consider there's that risk, it's more likely that they'll just think, well, I might as well go ahead and do it. So that would be my key takeaway.
And Brid, on the computer side, cyber side?
Well, I suppose for the corporates, you know, now's the time to be really seriously giving consideration to your cybersecurity measures rather, and considering any additional steps because of that increased home working. You need to be protecting specifically devices and connections, and warning employees about the increased likelihood of phishing attempts and scams regularly. Also, there needs to be a reminder about company policies, you know, updates and passwords, etc. And then if the worst does happen, that employees have immediate access, you know, for help concerns. So they've got that number for the IT helpline, so that staff, you know, steps can be taken immediately. And then, you know, it's worth noting some attacks will succeed. We can see that in the media. So looking at post-event assurances and lessons to be learned. And what I would say as well, for what I find really helpful rather, is the NCSC government website, because that's detecting, you know, in particular scams which are on the increase or whatever, and corporates or IT departments responsible for cybersecurity should be monitoring that, so that information can then be filtered through to employees as to what is high risk at the minute.
Thank you very much. Well, the both of you have successfully frightened the life out of me that I'm going to be running back and checking my bank accounts just to see how much I've lost. I'm clearly not aware of it going on, Alex, so I'm clearly losing money hand over fist somewhere. And I've got this sort of impression of the two of you as sort of fraud superheroes, keeping the world safe from the bad guys. So thank you very much. It's been a very interesting presentation and really put it in context very well. So thank you both. And thank you everyone for listening.
My pleasure.
Thank you.